With this patch you press one note and suddenly a whole band starts playing, and in this video I want to show you how you can set this up with Arturia Pigments or possibly also other synthesizers, because you'll see that it's mainly about the thought process and your imagination rather than only the mere technicalities of your synthesizer. So let's check out how this goes. First of all, hi and welcome to this video. My name is Yannis, and first let's check those individual parts, because it's separated into three individual parts. You have the utility engine and engine 1 and 2. In this case, engine 1 is built out of three different samples and makes our drum beat, and it sounds like this on itself. Now, engine 2 is our kind of harmony chord thing that sounds like this on itself. And then we also have the utility engine that has the bass, which is this oscillator on the bottom, and some noise making this kind of irregular kind of stuff that happens on the top end, which I really enjoy. And isolated it sounds like this. And I just overall really enjoy this patch. It sounds like some industrial bots of Canada thing for me. And I want to explain those individual parts to you, but first we have to check that the sequencer is activated, because we need some triggers. If the sequencer is not activated, it depends on your MIDI clip. And here in this case we have one note for one bar and then it changes. It could also stay on the same note, but I want to have a little bit of chord progression so it sounds more interesting. But in this case we would only get a trigger in the beginning of a bar and then nothing, and that's not enough for this type of patch to be working. And under sequence you can just activate it, and it could also be just 8 slots or however I just like to fill it up. So the notes don't matter, velocity, octave, all doesn't matter. It's only important that we get those impulses and steps. For the drum part I used the sampler, and what I like a lot about the Pigment sampler is that you can load in multiple samples, so you're not restricted to using one sample. So you can see I have some kick drum on slot A, some hi-hat on slot B, and some snare drum on slot C. And then you have different modes on how you can trigger the samples, and that's where it gets really interesting, because if you go to map and then the sample pick knob, you can basically use this knob to determine what kind of sample you hear, and you can modulate this knob. So right now we would only hear like the kick drum, but if you move it to B, you have the hi-hat, and on C you have the snare drum. Then I was applying some function envelope that you can see here, and I just deselected it for showing you the basic sample map function first. Now I'm going to activate it, and now you can see how this envelope triggers the individual samples in a way that it sounds like some drum beat. And when you're setting this up, you need to listen to the beat while you adjust the height, because this you have to do by ear. There's no kind of systematic number for it. You basically have to test where you have to put this thing in order to hear, for example, the snare. So if this one would be too low, we would not trigger the snare. See, now it stays at B. So we have to put it higher and have to figure out where we have to go. If you only have 3 samples, it's kind of simple, because you basically have the middle, then all the way on the bottom and all the way on the top, but you could also use up to 6 samples, so then it gets a little more tricky, and yeah, you just have to figure it out on yourself for every individual example. And also if you put those envelopes really sharp, like if I would put this snare drum here, I realized that sometimes you lose a trigger. See, actually now it didn't trigger, so it's a wise idea to give it this kind of preview lift, I don't know how to call it, but then it usually triggers. Like some look ahead, that's the word I was looking for. Then I was also adding a bit of bit crushing, and it sounded particularly great with the other voices. On itself it sounds a little goofy, but here you can see the setting, it's almost all the way to the right. And also important is that for the output, I routed it to filter 1, but I think it's actually like this by default. But later you'll see that we'll actually split the paths of the signals. So here on the filter routing, we have the split mode, and make sure that we can treat at least 2 signals independently. And the last important thing is that you unselect the piano icon, because if the piano icon is selected, it means that when you change the pitch, like we already do with this little chord progression, it would also change the pitch of the sample, which is something that we don't want, because this would mean every time we change the pitch, also the sound of the drums changed, and we want to have the consistent drum sound. So you have to make sure that this is unselected, and then it will just stay untouched no matter what kind of pitch you press on your keyboard. Next, let's check out this pad sound, which I really enjoy, and this one definitely brings in this kind of Boards of Canada vibe here. I was using the analog engine and created the kind of chord sound with those 3 oscillators, because the first one just has the basic pitch, then the second one is tuned 7 semitones up, and the third one is tuned 14 semitones up, and it's this super typical Boards of Canada voicing, where you basically have 2/5. It's super open sounding, it's incredibly beautiful. So this is, first of all, the most important thing here. And actually the chorus is brought down, but this is something you have to check in relation with your sequencer. I just enjoyed the sound a little more 1 octave down. You could also have it in 1 octave up. That's basically all depending on your type of patch. And then I just tried to make it sound really beautiful. Like, first of all, I needed to adjust the envelope and make the release longer. So here you can see it's like 3.8 seconds. Because if it's too short, you get the kind of sequencer sound. So if I do this, and that's kind of one limitation that you have. If you need the sequencer to trigger the individual steps, it's difficult to make really spacious pad sounds, but one kind of workaround would be to make the release longer, so you get this kind of overlap, and this way you still have the kind of pulse, but not as strongly. I can't really decrease the attack, because then we also kill the samples. So if I do this, you can hear that for the drums, we would take away the attack and all the kind of drum character. So we have to use the release. By the way, if you enjoyed this video and would also like to support the channel, you can quickly take a second to click the like button. Thanks. And then I just really like to create this kind of detuned sound. So here you can see that oscillator 2 and 3 are a little detuned, like 2 is a little up and oscillator 3 a little down. Also adding a little bit of the drift thing, which also makes the tuning less stable, but if you use it too much, it just sounds too much like a bad copy of something analog. But if you just use a little, it's actually cool. Generally with those detuned effects, I feel like little things every now and then do more than one big effect on the whole sum or something. And also I used LFO1 to slightly modulate the fine-tuning that you can see here. It just shifts a bit around, so we get some additional detuning here, and that's the first LFO free running, so it just basically constantly changes the tuning. And then we get this wonderful, beautiful sound. And there's one more thing, because you can see that the volume also gets slightly ducked, and I was creating some second function envelope, not the first one, the second one, that is only triggering like the quarter notes, like some sidechain effect. So it's not perfectly resembling the drum part, but it's fine. I just want to get this kind of ducking effect on the quarter notes. So function 2 just brings down the volume slightly. So when this activates, you can always hear that the 1, 2, 3, 4 are a little bit ducked. Also, it's being routed to filter 1, which is actually not active because I didn't want to filter anything here because we need the high end. But now the utility engine is the one that gets sent to filter 2, and we're going to look at next. So the bass really needs some effects, because otherwise it sounds really dull. Also because the utility oscillator doesn't have many settings. You can basically change the waveform and the pitch, and that's all. So it goes to filter 2 this time. So here we use a little filter, but with a very gentle setting. And without the effects, you will see that it sounds really dull. By the way, if you feel like, okay, this is all great and fun, but I definitely need this one short introduction to synthesizers and all the basics, just check out the class that I link in this info box. And one main problem that we have here is that due to the long release that we need for the Engine 2, the kind of pad thing to sound more beautiful, we get some overlap here, and without the effects it's way too obvious and doesn't really sound that good. And you can also see that I used the same function envelope that we know from Engine 2 for also ducking this signal on 1, 2, 3, 4. So for effects I first used some chorus in order to make it less dry and give it a little more of this nasty detuned sound. Then I used the delay for making it a little more wavy, so it doesn't sound too much like the sequencer, like the initial sequencer, and more like some wavy kind of bass thing. It's difficult to describe. Let's just listen to it. And also in the end a little compressor just for making it a little more consistent and stable, but it's just maybe like 2, maximum 3 dB of gain reduction. Let's now go to my favorite part, which are the noise generators, and let's once listen to them isolated. And here I basically picked some noise I liked. I never think much about it, I just go by intuition. And used those random envelopes, which are just absolutely amazing, the binary ones, for just sometimes bringing them in and taking them out. So it's only 2 stages. Sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not there. And I also used 2 different ones, so those 2 noise things don't have the same envelope, because otherwise it would be a little static. So we have 2 independent, randomly generated noise voices. And also for the tuning, I used this time, let's see which one of those LFOs is it? Both of them actually. So LFO 2 and 3 are both some random LFOs. So you can see that some new value gets sent out every quarter note, I think. And in this case, you can see here that the pitch changes, because it sounds super amazing when the pitch of the noise changes. It's really one of my favorite types of sounds. And if you want to generate randomly generated noise textures, you should always try this, and I find this highly enjoyable. And the very last thing I didn't mention yet is that on FXA, which basically has everything apart from the bass, I use a little bit of EQ to just clean up this mid-range thing, because you can't do too much here because we don't have those many independent channels. And if you take out something here, you might harm another track that goes through the same path. So I did it very gently, just a little bit of mid-range taken out and just boosting the high frequencies a bit, and also a little bit of compression for making it more stable, but it's very, very tiny changes. If you're interested in learning more about Pigments, and especially those super amazing sequencing functions, you're warmly invited to check out this playlist here. Apart from that, I wish you lots of inspiration with whatever it is that you create, and I hope to see you soon again at this channel. Bye!